Did the United States create a vacuum for terrorist organizations to exist after they left the Afghanistan Soviet conflict? After the Soviets retreated back to the Soviet Union in 1990, the United States funding of the Mujahideen, the Afghan Mujahideen, ended abruptly, leaving the country in a state of disarray. There was no plan to help reconstruct the country, and with the whatever few entities left within the communist government of Afghanistan was left to battle the many competing Islamic sects that were existing in the country, as well as the native Afghan Pashtuns. This created two civil wars within that country in the next 9 years, which would kill more people as opposed to the 10-year war with the Soviet Union, a complete bloodbath. The second civil war was involving two entities known as the Northern Alliance, led by Ahmad Shah Massoud, a Western favorite, and the Taliban, led by Mullah Omar. In 1990, when the United States basically left Afghanistan to its own desires, Osama Bin Laden, a young Saudi construction magnate, returned back home to Saudi Arabia as a national hero, considered the face of global jihadism. The notion of jihadism, which permeates from Saudi Arabia, whose ideology helped shape the country back in 1744, when it was called the Emirate of Diriyah, which is known as Wahhabi or Wahhabism, which was the founder of Wahhabism, Muhammad ibn Abdul al-Wahhab, who, along with Muhammad ibn al-Saud, helped create the first Saudi state in the Middle East. This ideology, along with the political precepts of Ibn Saud, would shape the country. And in the last 200 years, it is still the longest running monarchical dictatorship in the world. Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy, and it is led by the Quran and the Hadiths, or the Sunnah, which are basically the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad. And these texts are declared the constitution of the country. There are no national elections, and they're not permitted. It is always consistently ranked as one of the worst countries in regards to human rights. The precepts of Wahhabism is basically ultra-Orthodox. And there are Sunni theologians, which is coming out of the branch of Sunni Islam, but there are many Sunni theologians that consider Wahhabi Islam as an abridged version of Sunni Islam and not Islamic at all. And it depends on who you speak with in regards to Sunni theologians. Nevertheless, this would help shape the mindsets of many ultra-Orthodox leaders throughout the Arab world, not just Osama bin Laden, but also to Sayyid Qutb, who is the co-founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, and is considered the godfather of jihadism, the terminology of jihadism. Hassan al-Banna was actually the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood out of Egypt. And much later, other notable extremists, far more extremist than Qutb or Banna. Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of one of the co-leaders of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. Abdullah Azam, who was influenced by Wahhabi Islam when he lived and taught Sharia law in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the founder of the Islamic State in Iraq, which later became the Islamic State in the Levant. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIL, the Islamic State in Levant. Jalaluddin Haqqani, the leader of the Haqqani network, and there are dozens of others. These individuals would help form and create some of the most extreme organizations the world has ever seen, and all propagated by this ideology that is influenced by the Saudi petrodollar throughout the world, but mainly a concentration within the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and of course, to an extent, the United States. This ideology of Wahhabi Islam began to take shape in the 1980s during the height of the Afghan-Soviet War, when notable Sunni theologians, Wahhabi theologians, such as Abdullah Azam, would come to the United States and propagate and try to influence American Muslims to come join the jihad that was happening in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, large Islamic organizations existing in New York, Michigan, Oklahoma, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Houston, Texas, key states, St. Louis, Missouri, Newark, New Jersey. These would become the hotspots for these madrasas that were funded by the Saudi petrodollar in spreading this ideology and trying to encourage American Muslims from becoming too westernized or too influenced by the United States, which was considered a secular nation, according to the Wahhabi view. And so when you have individuals such as Abdul Azam and later Omar Abdel Rahman, who is the leader of Gamma Islamiyah in Egypt, a terrorist organization, who is also in the United States, spewing and espousing anti-American ideals, as well as being an anti-Semitic individual who hated Israel. However, the United States foreign policy also lends to the argument that these Wahhabists were indeed calling out or critiquing the prejudicial view of how the United States sees the Middle East. The United States, of course, their most influential and politically astute ally is Israel. Although Saudi Arabia is also an ally, but for a different reason, which is basically formed with not just the petrodollar, which is a huge reason, but also they use the United States, they use Saudi Arabia as a military advantage. And in 1990, it was Saudi Arabia who would make a huge mistake, which would have ramifications, not just for the kingdom, but for the United States, in regarding that they conceived that Iraq was a threat to them militarily. This came on false intelligence that Iraq was building a military front after the invasion of Kuwait, which was condemned by the Wahhabists around the world, as well as Bin Laden. But the false intelligence was reporting that Iraq Ba'athist army was getting ready to invade Saudi Arabia. This was not the case. However, the kingdom, led by King Fahd, who is a strong ally to the United States, was implied by Osama bin Laden to a meeting. And this meeting would take place in front of Prince Turki Al Saud, Al Faisal, who is the General Intelligence Directorate leader, which is the intelligence arm of Saudi Arabia. He's the director, in which bin Laden proposes that the country be defended with his Mujahideen fighters fresh off their victory of the Soviet Union, in which King Fahd actually took as almost as an insult that this ragtag bunch of Wahhabists would actually defend the nation. And so King Fahd, who is actually friendly with Ronald Reagan, invited the United States to defend it militarily. This would cause a global critique regarding the more astute Wahhabi theologians, in which they considered the United States to be polytheists and secularists, in the same view as the Soviet Union, defending the two most holiest places in all of Islam, Mecca and Medina. Bin Laden and they knew that bin Laden would be a threat now that the United States was coming to Saudi Arabia. So they put him under house arrest and suspended his finances, which were coming from his father's construction company, which he had a share, which was the Saudi bin Laden Group. After being expelled from the country, in which he brokered a deal with Prince Turki, bin Laden relocated to the Sudan. And from here, along with Mujahideen fighters, as well as Egyptian radical fundamentalists, headed by Ayman al-Zawahiri, who then traveled with him to the Sudan in Khartoum, they helped create Al-Qaeda. The ideology is based upon the Wahhabi principles promulgated by Saudi Arabia. And at around this time, Saudi Arabia is under intense financial disarray. In fact, there is a large contingent of poverty that is happening in financial class warfare in the country. So during this very sensitive time within the kingdom, in order for it to defend itself from these Wahhabi organizations like Al-Qaeda, they started using blackmail payments to these groups in order for bin Laden not to attack the kingdom itself, because they considered the kingdom to become too friendly to the United States, and they would consider the kingdom un-Islamic, or not adhering to the strict tenets of Sharia, which is ironic because the country actually is formed and shaped, molded by the principles of Sharia law under the Wahhabi principles. With the United States now seemingly unaware of this burgeoning threat that is forming in the Middle East, which I find to be hard to believe, considering that the intelligence apparatuses, such as the CIA and the Pakistan ISI, who have been around for decades and who actually helped fund the Mujahideen against their fight with the Soviets in the tune of hundreds of $millions, led by the CIA operation called Operation Cyclone, which was the largest funded CIA operation in history, even to the present day. I find it hard to believe that these intelligence agencies, like the CIA, didn't understand that the Frankenstein monsters that they helped create to fight the Soviets wouldn't come back and visit them. And I would use that argument with Saudi Arabia itself, that by pumping in hundreds of $millions to these madrasas worldwide and help fermenting this ideology, creating these organizations would come back and visit them, in which it did to an extent. But the United States would become the biggest victim. They would have the most extensive international terrorist attacks from Al-Qaeda in regards to the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Even though Ramzi Youssef is not an Al-Qaeda member, but his clan, which is originated out of Baluchistan, which is a small province inside Pakistan, whose uncle is Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who didn't submit to Bayat, which is a declaration of loyalty to Bin Laden, but he did after the 9/11 attacks. So you have two primary members who adhere to the Wahhabi principles in Pakistan, who are a separate issue from Al-Qaeda, but later would have influence within Al-Qaeda after the attacks. So Ramzi Youssef, who is considered the mastermind behind the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who is considered the mastermind or the plotter of the 9/11 operation, the planes operation. They were also the primary, both of them, primary orchestrators of the Bajinka plot, in which I have done a previous video regarding the Bajinka plot and the anniversary that happened last month. And so, seemingly, the United States, in its Russian effort to leave Afghanistan, created this vacuum for these organizations like Al-Qaeda to exist, because that they didn't help in rebuilding the country in which it helped destroy, and of course with the economic sanctions on Iran, on Iraq in 1990 during the Gulf War, in which it helped killed approximately 500,000 women and children. The military invasion of Mogadishu, the continued military invasion of Iraq, as well as its disastrous one-sided foreign policy regarding Israel and Saudi Arabia. This all helps permeate a large global international response from this terrorist ideology, this ultra-Orthodox ideology of Wahhabi Islam, and the terrorist organizations that are created by the tenets of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, which are basically funded by Saudi Arabia, in which I would say with conviction that we should never consider Saudi Arabia as an ally. In fact, they're an enemy. Even to the current day, they're consistently an abuser of not just human rights within their own country, but right now they're considered to be the purveyors of the largest humanitarian crisis in the world, in the conflict with Yemen, in which is backed by the U.S. dollar, in which we give financial aid to Saudi Arabia every 3 years. The largest aid package, military aid package, we gave in 2017 by the Trump administration, in which most of that military aid went to the conflict in Yemen. And so I would submit to you that during this period of 1990 and onward, that the United States seemingly, with their assuredness that the conflict was over in Afghanistan and leaving the country to its own devices, helped create this atmosphere for the terrorists to conduct operations, not just inside the country, but around the world, as well as creating the atmosphere to continue forward under the watchful eye of the CIA and other intelligence agencies like the Pakistan ISI, without any warning inside the United States, and seemingly oblivious to the monsters that they helped create with their own ignorance? Or was it on purpose?